I'm Paul, and I'm presenting joint work with Narges, Ariel, Alex, and Andy. We studied how to allocate refugee families across localities in a country, such that these families are as likely as possible to find employment, and taking into account that the families arrive in an online fashion across the year. I will start with some background on refugee resettlement and on the paper that our work builds up on. Then I want to outline our algorithmic approach and give some results. I will touch upon a specific issue we encountered, the fact that the total number of arriving refugees is hard to estimate, but is very important in making these allocation decisions. And then I want to share some information about our implementation of this algorithm with one of the US resettlement agencies. Around the world, there are 26 million refugees. Every year, around 200,000 of the most vulnerable refugees get resettled to third countries, and historically, the United States is one of the largest intakers of such refugees. The State Department has a program that allows such refugees to fly into the country, gives them a permit to work, and puts them onto a pathway to becoming permanent residents. But most of the work of integration falls not on the State Department, but on 1 out of 9 resettlement agencies. Throughout this talk, I will focus on a specific resettlement agency, HIAS, that we've been working with. After a refugee family has been allocated to HIAS, there's a second stage of allocation, which is the one that this paper is concerned with. Namely, HIAS has affiliates in cities around the country, 20 of them approximately. And this means that they have offices in these cities and they have contacts to local synagogues. The kind of services and the kind of support that a refugee family can experience coming into the country crucially depends on the affiliate that they're allocated to. So it should come as no surprise that this choice of affiliate has long-lasting impacts on their integration success and on their well-being. In this paper, we optimize a specific metric of integration, which is finding employment within 6 months, which is something that the State Department greatly cares about. This work builds on an earlier paper by my collaborators in operations research. In this paper, they designed a software platform called Ahani that is now in use by HIAS, and Ahani has 2 components. One component estimates employment probabilities. That is, given a refugee and given an affiliate, it tries to return a probability that this refugee will find employment if they are placed into that affiliate. The second component is one of matching. You can see it on the left, where for the HIAS employees, it suggests which families should be placed in which affiliate in order to maximize the overall employment as estimated by the first component. In our work, we're keeping untouched the first component, but we will try to improve the matching stage in a way that will become apparent in a few slides. Before I do that, let me just talk about the matching problem as it is currently considered by Ahani. On the left-hand side, you can see 2 fictitious affiliates, Austin and Boston. And on the right-hand side, you can see 3 families of different sizes. The edges here are colored, but this really represents edge weights. These edges are weighted by an employment score, which is the expected number of family members who would find employment if that family was to be placed into that affiliate. Green is supposed to represent higher employment scores, and red is supposed to represent employment scores closer to 0. The task of allocation is choosing an affiliate for every refugee family, and doing that in such a way that the total sum of employment scores is maximized. But of course, we cannot just allocate every family to their most preferred affiliate, because these affiliates have capacities. These capacities are signed off by the State Department, and they hold for a whole matching period, which is 1 fiscal year. So here, for example, Austin and Boston can both only accommodate 5 refugees in this fiscal year. Ahani takes the matching problem into account as I've presented it here. So it solves this matching problem using integer linear programming. But one thing that it does not take into account is that the real matching problem solved by HIAS is not an offline problem, where the matching characteristics of all the families are known from the beginning, but is an online problem, where weekly batches of refugees arrive and have to be immediately and irrevocably assigned. So for example, these 2 families might be arriving in the first batch, and we must decide on whether to place each of them into Austin or Boston before we can observe the characteristics of the next family. Given that Ahani does not take into account this online nature, the way that it is currently employed is essentially greedy. That is, in every weekly batch, it maximizes the sum of employment scores for this weekly batch without any consideration towards the future. So in this example, this would mean that both the family of 3 and the single individual get matched to Austin, and this leaves a capacity of 1 there. The challenge now is that if the couple arrives in a subsequent week, they no longer fit into Austin because there's only 1 unit of capacity left, and so they have to go to Boston even though they would have greatly profited from going to Austin over Boston. And in hindsight, perhaps we should have rather allocated the single individual to Boston, given that she had very similar employment outcomes in both of these, and then we would have had the capacity free for the couple. Our work is motivated by some observations that suggest that something similar might actually be happening in practice. Let me share this on the next slide. On the x-axis of this graph, we chart all the refugees arriving in a specific fiscal year in their order of arrival. On the y-axis, you see a smoothed average of the employment score that these refugees obtain at the affiliate that they get matched to by a certain matching. And the matchings that we consider are the optimal matching in hindsight in blue, and the greedy matching that corresponds to what Ahani wants in orange. And we can see here that the greedy matching obtains higher employment scores very early in the year, but then falls back towards the end of the year, and there's a big gap all the way at the end of the year, which leads to a total loss in employment of around 10%. The following graph might explain why that is. Again, on the x-axis, you see the refugees, and on the y-axis, there's a measure of the capacity still left in the affiliates. But rather than just summing up the amount of capacity, we're weighting capacity higher if it comes from affiliates that are very useful in generating employment, such as Austin in the previous example, and weigh it less if it comes from affiliates such as Boston that were not as useful in generating employment. You can see here that the optimal matching in hindsight burns through this weighted capacity at a very uniform rate. By contrast, the greedy matching uses this capacity very aggressively early in the year, but then runs nearly out of it towards the last third, and this might explain why the employment scores become so much worse. So, what could an algorithm do differently than greedy does? We think that greedy really only considers half of the picture, because the act of allocating a refugee I into an affiliate L is really twofold. One part of the effect is well taken into consideration by greedy, the fact that this, of course, increases our employment objective by the employment score. But there's a secondary effect as well, namely that there's an opportunity cost to using up that capacity in the current batch, which will then not be available for generating employment in future batches. So we think that a myopic algorithm ought to take into account both of these effects, rather than only one, and it ought to maximize the employment score minus the opportunity cost. How can we estimate the opportunity cost? We simulate continuations of the current fiscal year. That is, we calculate the expected number of refugee families that we expect to see from the current point in time to the end of the fiscal year, and then we draw that many random refugee families, and we draw them from the refugee families who have arrived within the last 6 months. This expresses an assumption that the characteristics of refugee families can evolve over time, but tend to do so rather gradually. Now we can form a matching LP, where we try to match these simulated refugees to the remaining capacities in the affiliates. And the shadow prices of the affiliates' capacity constraints give us a notion of a per unit value of capacity in these affiliates. So then in the current batch, we will maximize the sum of employment scores minus the price of capacity used, where this price is calculated from the shadow prices times the amount of capacity used. How would this have helped in the previous example? Imagine that Austin was assigned a small positive price and Boston was assigned a price of 0. Most likely, if we are now maximizing employment minus price paid, this would not have changed the allocation decision for the family of 3. After all, they greatly preferred going to Austin rather than going to Boston. But for the single individual, the price might be larger than the difference in employment scores between Austin and Boston, which would mean that this individual would be allocated to Boston, which would then leave enough capacity open for the couple. Here you can see the graphs from before, but with an additional line for this pricing-based algorithm in purple. At the bottom, you can see that this pricing-based algorithm uses up the weighted capacity in a very similar pattern to the optimal matching in hindsight. And at the top, you can see that this is indeed used to generate employment scores that are very close to the optimal in hindsight. This trend holds true throughout the different fiscal years. So here you can see the fiscal years 2014 through 2019. And whereas the greedy algorithm typically obtains between 90 and 92% of the optimal employment in hindsight, the pricing-based algorithm obtains between 98 and 99%, closing nearly all of this gap. So it seems that we have a better algorithm on our hands and we should replace the greedy algorithm, and I certainly think that this is true. But for the sake of fairness, I want to mention one drawback that this pricing-based algorithm has. That is, it uses a bit of information that the greedy algorithm didn't use, the number of expected refugees still to arrive. In principle, this should not be a problem, because the State Department announces this number to hires before the start of every fiscal year. However, we found these numbers to be somewhat unreliable. If we force the pricing-based algorithm to just go off these official numbers, this does not completely change the story, but slightly reduces the benefit of switching from the greedy algorithms to a pricing-based algorithm. Setting aside the years of 2017 and 2018, we typically obtain 97 to 98% of the optimal matching in hindsight. 2017 and 2018 are special in that in these years, the official announcements for how many refugees would arrive were widely off. In 2017, they were about 50% too high, and in 2018, they were twice as high. And the reason is that these are the early years of the Trump presidency, where President Trump really limited how many refugees were coming into the country. To see what this does to our pricing-based algorithm, just look at the lower of these two graphs, where you can see the slope with which the pricing-based algorithm uses up the weighted capacity is very, very flat, because it tries to hit the zero line at the expected number of refugees, which is twice as large as the number of refugees who actually end up arriving. And this translates into prices that are much higher than they ought to be. And at the top, you can see that this in turn translates into suboptimal employment scores, which are lower than the employment scores obtained by the optimal matching in hindsight and by greedy. Naturally, we have explored alternative ways of predicting the number of refugees yet to arrive. However, we found this to be challenging for two reasons. First, there's limited data to learn from. Second, the number of arriving refugees is determined by events such as international crises, who wins elections, and immigration policy, none of which we can hope to extrapolate from refugee arrival data alone. But more fundamentally, we think that building an autonomous system that would still not be reliable is the wrong path to go. After all, we are working with an organization like HIRES that is already employing experts who are monitoring the policy situation with regards to its impact on refugee resettlement. So rather than building such an autonomous system, we go with the defaults announced by the State Department and make it easy for HIRES experts to override these defaults when they have better information available. We have implemented our algorithm in a new version of Ahani that is now being deployed with HIRES. On this slide, you can see a screenshot from the interface where the tiles ranging in color from green to red correspond to refugee families. This interface allows HIRES employees to override the allocation recommendations made by the system, while the color allows them to make informed trade-offs not only with respect to the employment effects to the batch currently at hand, but also with respect to the cost to future arrivals of using up capacity right now. In this talk, we have extended the algorithmic approach underlying Ahani by simulating continuations of the year, by generating prices, and by using these prices to allocate current batches in a less greedy fashion. We have shown that if these approaches are provided with good estimates for how many refugees arrive overall, they can lead to an employment that is very close to optimal. While we have also seen that bad estimates can impact this employment, we make it easy for HIRES employees to provide us with the best estimates available. I would like to end by pointing out that, in general, research on refugee resettlement is very timely. The Biden administration has just announced that it will let more than 4 times more refugees into the country than was the case so far. So in the years to come, we hope that many more refugees will enter the country, and the affiliates will be operating much closer at capacity. And in this setting, we hope that innovations on refugee resettlement can help improve refugee outcomes. Thank you for your attention.